All right, welcome everybody. We are recording this session. So Kiara, I think did you get that going? Awesome. Well, thank you for choosing to spend this post-lunch hour with us for what we hope is a really interesting and rich conversation about decision-making dynamics and where they work and where they get tricky in the context of advocacy organizations and progressive movements for social justice. So let's start with some brief intros. I can start with myself. My name is Karina. I'm from August Public, and she, her pronouns are great for me. And we are a future of work consultancy, and we focus on helping orgs adopt new ways of working. Our work focuses on things like agility, empowerment, inclusion. And we often say we're obsessed with how folks get their work done. Like what we do is hard enough, and how we do doesn't have to be quite so hard. We work with organizations from all different sectors, and one of our mandates as a B Corp is sharing that learning. I am not a super weedy, deep expert on advocacy organizations, but you know who is? Sasha, who is our special guest for today. We're super lucky to have her here and joining us. Sasha, I'm going to do like the briefest intro of you and then I hand it over to you. So you are a seasoned advocate and activist in the movement for reproductive justice, among many others, and a longtime operative of New York City politics and a former August pal, which is the best. I feel like no intro can do you justice, so I'll hand it over to you. Anything else you want to highlight about the experience that you bring to this conversation?
Sure. Hi, everyone. My name is Sasha Ahuja. I use the pronouns she and her. Born and raised in New York. I have lived here my entire life, and I've had the privilege of working in lots of organizations over the duration of my career that have really been at the forefront of moving forward change when directly impacted people feel the deep experience of multiple forces of oppression. It is those of us who are most impacted that are closest to the pain. I'm wearing my Ayanna Pressley shirt today. It's like policy is my life. So Ayanna Pressley says those who are closest to the pain should be closest to the power. And so I've been really, really inspired by that. I got my start in movement building when I was 17 years old. My dad drove a yellow taxi in New York City, and I started organizing with the New York Taxi Workers Alliance. I was very much so a child of the 9/11 generation and felt the deep burden and impact of surveillance and control of Muslim and South Asian people in New York right after 9/11, and was very deeply politicized by my dad's work, which was dignified work in the form of driving yellow taxi up and down the streets of New York City. And started organizing with the Yellow Taxi Union. Folks may most recently remember the taxi union for organizing a ban at JFK, stopping work in response to the Muslim ban. More recently, a lot of the news that we've heard out of the yellow taxi industry and how it suffered in the face of big tech, Uber and Lyft, and the realities that folks face having to deal with a really predatory industry. So that's work that has been in my roots. And since then, I've had the privilege of working in and out of advocacy organizations, local government, and my short stint at August to really think about how organizations help us to drive forward change, the things that they box us in to do, because sometimes the imaginations of our organizations are really limited. And then the ways that we, as organizers, like break those systems within organizations to really help to unlock our collective potential. And in moments where so many folks are feeling an enormous amount of stress, given the reality of the last 2.5 years in particular, coming off of the Trump era, the deep, deep impact that COVID has wielded upon our communities, a summer of rage in the summer of 2020, where I think I, like many of you, felt like there was this glimmer of hope that things could be different, and then this massive pendulum swing back. And so through my experience in my career, I feel like, I've had a lot of jobs. My work has really been the same, to help to move people, mission-driven people towards their purpose, which is helping to move our system so that they serve us better, and that they are in service of those of us that have been most deeply impacted by systems of oppression. So I'm really grateful to be here. I'm really excited to be in dialogue with all of you and really think about the things that I learned in my year or so at August that felt so deeply aligned to social justice and movement building work. And I think some of the ways in which we think about organizations in the time that I spent thinking about the future of work is very much so applicable to sort of how I think about movements as living and breathing organizations that are constantly molding and responsive to the world around them. But also people are bringing their whole selves to those spaces, in that they're bringing their whole identities, their experiences, directly impact experiences, and experiences of real pain and trauma into the work. So how do we transform that and center that in ways that help us to push change forward? So it's a little bit about me and the lens I hope to bring, and I'm really, really grateful to be in conversation with all of you.
Thanks, Sasha. Speaking of all of you, we did want this, it's like one part fireside chat, one part roundtable. So we're doing two things. One is Cassidy has invited anyone who wants to come into the circle here and like be on video or not and be able to come on and off mute. We really welcome you to do that, because we want this to be a conversation, and at different moments, we're gonna like open it up and hear what your experience has been. Also, be great if we could just get in the chat and have you share a couple of things about you. Like if you have an organizational affiliation, please, feel free to share that, and just like who you are and really why did you come? Why are you here? How does decision making impact your work? Would love to hear, even just very briefly, why you're here. Give folks a second to do that. We also have a number of August pals who have joined. Cassidy is here supporting, and we have Mike and Erica from our team as well. Thanks, Kiara, for sharing that. Notice team, Kiara knows is the team she worked with the highest turnover or most frustration, usually have unclear ways of making decisions. Whew, boy, that resonates. All right, I think we'll give folks a minute to voice that in while we keep on going. Let's see. Let's just take a look at Kim. Thanks, Kim. Working in food and farmer advocacy, curious how to deal with hierarchical issues in decision-making, hoping to find some tools and tricks around creating more collaborative decision-making processes. Great. Awesome. So keep on sharing that. But Sasha, let's get into it. So our first kind of topic is around choices and trade-offs. Which I think is something that comes up a lot. And I want to kind of take as an example May 2nd. So that was the day after Politico leaked the Supreme Court decision about the overturning of Roe. And within 24 hours, there were 10,000 people in Foley Square. And I know you were really central to that organizing effort. And my sense is that those kinds of rapid response moments, like there's a lot of decision making that was happening in those 24 hours. And, I think one of the best practices that we know in decision making is just like breaking big decisions apart. So will you just talk to us a little bit about like, what were some of the calls that you felt you had to make, and what choices did you end up, or kind of trade-offs did you end up making when you were in that first kind of 24-hour rapid response period?
Sure, absolutely. So I will say, I feel like I didn't introduce myself with the hat that I'm wearing now. So I am at Planned Parenthood. I worked at Planned Parenthood many years ago and have returned in August, right before SB 8 went into effect in Texas. Folks know there are just a sort of lay of the land and what we're experiencing around abortion access in this country. Two things are happening at the same time. States are moving forward egregious abortion bans. Texas, 6 weeks, Oklahoma, an all-out ban. The Texas ban has been in place for over 280 days. So there has been essentially no access to abortion in the state. And Oklahoma implemented an all-out ban that's been in place for 20 days. So states are moving forward these efforts. There are also significant rollbacks in states, Georgia, Arizona, Idaho, et cetera. And that is all in anticipation for, as Karina alluded to, what we expect to be a Supreme Court decision in the Dobbs versus Jackson Women's Health case to overturn Roe v. Wade. And so we all watched on May 2nd as Politico essentially had a draft leaked opinion from Justice Alito that sort of laid out the worst scenario that we can imagine is that there will be a complete overturn of Roe v. Wade, and states will be left up to decide what abortion access looks like. In that reality, 26 states are likely to ban abortion in very, very quick succession. That leak, of course, was an unprecedented moment. It has not happened in the history of the Supreme Court in this country. And so the shock that we all experienced, you can imagine the shock that folks at an organization like Planned Parenthood experienced. So I play a national role, but feel very grateful to have deep roots in New York, where I'm from, and knew that folks were going to turn up at the Supreme Court in DC. We're going to show up in their local town squares, courthouses, et cetera. And that New York City and New York as a state, we need to make sure here locally, like a lot of folks in blue states, are anticipating, we're going to be a state that sees an influx of patients that are seeking care. And what we know from Texas and Oklahoma, folks are not getting on a flight and flying with, all of they're getting in their car, and gas is super expensive, and they're getting in their car and then driving to the closest state that they can find with access. And so New York should be a state where all of us are opening our arms and doing what we can to fund abortion outright, to support people with travel, to help to address people's immediate needs, knowing that those short-term things are critical and important, but they're just Band-Aids. We also want to make sure we're preparing for that long-term fight. So in the spirit of that reality and sort of the frame of New York being a welcoming state, I had the opportunity to reach out at a sort of like quick, what happens in these moments of rapid response, and to the moment of to the frame of the moment that we're in. I think about what we've learned through the Trump era. I think about what we've learned through the George Floyd protests and really the huge elevation of the Black Lives Matter movement in the summer of 2020 and onwards, and how in these moments of rapid response, we have choice points that we make in terms of what the shape of those moments looks like. And it is upon us to say the folks that have been most removed from our movements, but most directly impacted, must be at the center. And so for me here in New York, that looked like making sure that that myself as a non-Black person of color, my job was to get to work. My job is to fall back and help to move and stay in the background and make sure we're elevating Black and Latino folks in our city and in our state that are doing the grassroots work that for a long time have predicted this moment, for a long time told us that large national organizations sometimes can't get out of their own way, that the energy and the innovation is always going to happen at the grassroots because they're faster and more nimble. And so in this moment of rapid response, those are the folks that need to be front and center. Functionally, that meant the night of reaching out to partners across the social justice movement to say, hey, we know this leak happened. No one really understands what this moment means. Let's get together tomorrow morning when the dust sort of settles at 8 a.m. and make sure that we're quickly organizing and are really, really clear about what the next day needs to look like. That to me meant reaching out to not just your usual suspects, the Planned Parenthoods and the NARALs and the folks that do repro work, but our immigrant rights partners, our labor partners, elected officials that were elected by the grassroots who have deep connection and validation in community, that we were reaching out to folks that also have been instrumental in mass mobilizations in years past, particularly some folks who had served as founders of the original Women's March in 2017, many of whom are from New York. My goal was to make sure that we had the credibility from folks who have done large scale events, the credibility from folks who are deeply rooted in community and can quickly reach out and are trusted to mobilize folks to show up, and the ability to say, we're going to make sure that the message in this moment is very, very clear and consistent. While in New York, our issue might not be access to abortion, our issue in New York is equity. We have a deeply unequal healthcare system in this city. Black women are 8 times more likely to die during childbirth than their white counterparts. That is unacceptable. And if there's an influx of people coming into the state, we need to make sure that very, very specific solutions that come from Black communities that are centering what health equity looks like, that is across the lifespan, that it is those demands and those calls to action that are front and center. Yes, abortion will be legal in this state, no matter what. I feel really lucky to live here. And I know that is not the case, but our focus here has to be focused on equity. And in organizing a rapid response event, it was those voices that we need to make sure we're front and center.
Yeah, my brain is I'm making this like mental list of all the calls that you made there. It's like, when are you meeting the next day? You're like 8 a.m. Let's do it. Who's on that call, right? Who are you making sure are the folks that you are centering in that, even at the cost of getting like the usual suspects, like the obvious choices in there. And then something else you said was really interesting is like, what's the message? How can we be really clear together on like, what is the message that we are saying so that we can kind of speak with that voice as we show up to this event? And I think, that thinking through, and the other thing I think you said is just like, what are we doing tonight? Rather than like, what are we going to do to boil the ocean? What are we going to do to like take all of this on? The notion that like we just have to start with the next 24 hours. And then after that, it's a whole nother set of choices. And then being really, from what you're saying, it sounds like being super explicit about centering at every point the folks who are most impacted. And am I hearing you right, that it was sort of like just speaking that centering and that trade-off just over and over at every point, that sort of like laddered up to every decision that was made in those 24 hours. I think that's another one of these like decision-making best practices, like who are you centering, even if it's at the cost of including someone else's voice who might be nice to have, but doesn't need to be like at the center of what we're doing, because we have to move so fast. Does that feel like a trade-off between like speed and inclusion? I feel like that's something that folks are always like, how do I have both, move fast and be inclusive? Like, how do we crack that in your experience?
Yeah, it's such an important question. And I think that oftentimes is the trade-off. We want to move fast. And that means that people who are able to move fast participate, people who have capacity, people who have the time, people who have the resources. And so for me, as someone who works at an organization in this moment that has like a large national social justice organization and a $1 billion healthcare provider, and an organization that in crisis moments, as acute as those crises feel, has the ability to bring in resources in those moments, it is on us to make sure that when we are bringing folks in, that we are, especially in moments of rapid response, that we're able to compensate folks for their time, that we're able to provide rapid response, like very quick cash in and cash out, so that we can get the resources that we need, so our events and our moments can be accessible. So May 2nd, the leak happened. May 3rd, we did these rapid response actions, and then that scaled up to rapid response actions that happened nationally on May 14th. Hopefully you saw those. We took over the Brooklyn Bridge. It was really amazing. That was also the same day, of course, that there was a horrific incident of a massacre in Buffalo where 10 Black folks were killed at grocery shopping, of course, as we know, at a Tops grocery store. And so I will say that in planning the May 14th event as well, making sure that one thing that I think we oftentimes forego, not only inclusion when we're trying to move fast, but accessibility. The reality that we're still very much so in a pandemic. Showing up in the street is truly not for everybody. That is like not an accessible thing to many, many people, pandemic or not. And so we also needed to make sure we were making choices along the way. Like there are many, many ways to participate and respond. We were moving quickly on May 3rd and like didn't do a particularly accessible event. Just like the call to action was like be physically at this place at 5 o'clock. Like that works for some, that does not work for a lot of people. And it works for you if you have a job and you can get off at 4:45 and show up to something at 5:15. And many, many people are left out of that. And so accessibility is a thing that I'm actually really a learner in, and to make sure that when we're thinking about speed, that we're also not foregoing what it means to make sure that when we're structuring events and moments where people are gathering and also expressing rage in this like very visceral and really, really important way, in these moments that feel really chaotic, that we can both grieve, but also be in outrage publicly together, and the value of that and the history of that, that is facilitated by a focus on accessibility. And when I say accessibility, for people of all abilities to be able to like physically be at a thing, if it is within their capacity, and if it is not, how are folks going to be able to participate meaningfully from home, and or in the spaces that are accessible to them. That kind of toss up between inclusion and speed, and accessibility and speed and inclusion, I would say, sort of all together, leave us with a set of choice points. And sometimes it also means like in this moment, actually the thing that we're going to design for is this thing, and we're going to have to go with the coalition of the willing. And like, I'm going to acknowledge the limitations of that, and also invite other avenues for participation in ways that feel like they are within reach for other people. And the thing that we're doing is like a small snapshot of many, many things that are happening in the broader ecosystem. And how do we lift up all of those things together? For example, on May 3rd, showing up on the streets is one thing. We also made sure that the New York City, our New York City Abortion Fund, that's funding abortion outright, but helping people come into New York to seek care, that the calls to action that they're putting out to make sure supporters are donating directly, that those calls to action are also front and center, even though the folks that may work at that, who may be working at that organization, can't necessarily participate. So options for all of us, and also acknowledgement, like we are one action that is happening. We're not holding the whole necessarily, but part of like the 1,000 flowers blooming that needs to happen in these moments of rapid response.
Right, right. And what's interesting is hearing about, so there was the May 2nd moment, and then 2 weeks later, and you weren't, there was some deliberateness around, like, you knew accessibility was going to be difficult on the May 2nd one, but that felt like an appropriate trade-off for that fast action. But 2 weeks later, it wasn't an appropriate trade-off, right? You had that time to plan, to think, to design for folks to be able to participate physically or in other ways. And that became more of a priority, maybe at the cost of other things. I wanna, sorry, go ahead.
And just so for May 14th, the lessons were like, we need to make sure a live stream option is available. We need to make sure that fast snap actions are available for folks to be able to do from home. We need to have a home for all of the physical kind of setup of what we did on May 14th. We did a crossing the bridge kind of mass action, and then folks landed at Foley Square, where we kind of created what we called a welcome village, which was sort of like a physical like tents of 25 reproductive justice organizations, where if you're participating in action, you can plug in right away. We sort of created like a digital experience of that as well, so that you didn't have to be there to participate and support. You could go to bandsoffnyc.com and connect with organizations there. So regardless of your ability to physically show up in person, there are options for everyone to participate.
Right. So one of our goals here was to like open this conversation up. The question that I want to put to all of you is, can you share some experiences around how you navigate trade-offs? There's this kind of like trade-off around speed and inclusion, or speed and accessibility. Does that come up in your work? How does it show up? Or beyond just that one, like when we have to choose one really good thing over another really good thing, a really important thing, like, how do we do that? And how do we make that explicit to the folks that we're working with? I think we're just a moment to kind of open up the floor and welcome any stories or reflections that are coming up as you think about this concept of trade-offs and what Sasha is sharing with us. This is a like hand up, or just unmute yourself and put your voice in. Cassidy.
Yeah, hi Sasha, it's so great to meet you, and I'm grateful you're here today. I'm with the August team. I've been on our team for a year, but my former career was in the climate movement, and particularly climate advocacy. And something we ran into, particularly around decision-making, was navigating decision-making against like different beliefs around like what the policy solution is. There are like lots of different solutions that people want to advocate for. And when it comes to having the ear of those who are in power to actually pass policy, it's often like important to have a pretty direct message as possible, but that made it really difficult to get from an inclusive coalition space to the actual decision maker. And so I'm curious if that's something that you're experiencing in reproductive justice, as far as like how you're making decisions around choosing between a lot of different solutions and then actually pushing for one. Yeah, I'm really curious about that.
Sure. I will say this is a question that we're asking every day, because of reality and everyone in this moment, and we'll see this when the decision pops, everyone is looking for like, what is the fix? Joe Biden, you're in charge, like Democrats, you have control. What are we going to do? And the really, really unfortunate reality is that right now there is no federal fix. And so in turn, all of our pals, members of Congress, are introducing the widest range of bills that you could ever imagine. And really important things like protecting the privacy of patients, data privacy for healthcare. Things like we've seen Connecticut and New York and California pass laws to make sure that if you're seeking care in those states, that prosecutors will not participate if a prosecutor in Ohio is saying, you Ohio person came to New York and now I'm going to prosecute you because someone was aiding and abetting you seeking care and you broke the law. Like, nope, sorry, New York prosecutors are not going to participate. I'm obviously not a lawyer, so I'm botching the description of that. But so those sorts of laws. So there is a whole sea of like very varied things that we are seeing right now in the space. And I think to the point that Karina noted, like, how do we distill what the calls to action need to be in really, really simple words for folks to understand? And I can at least say from the Planned Parenthood side, it's getting care to people, getting people to care, and then funding abortion. That's it. Those are the fixes right now. And we know that there is going to be a bigger fight. We need to set ourselves up for the bigger fight. But now, and I will say probably for the next decade, this is going to be the fight. And it sounds like really demoralizing and really, really challenging to say, I'm going to put a bunch of Band-Aids on a really, really broken system. And I will say for patients that need abortions in 26 states, that is urgent work that we must commit to and we must do. Care to people, people to care, and funding abortion.
What's interesting to me about what you're saying, Sasha, is Cassidy's question was like, how do we decide on a policy? And what you're saying is we decide on policy directions. Like we decide on a couple of core messages and not on like, it's this policy or it's that policy. You're trying to bring like guiding principles and coherence to the movement without actually making like weedy choices for every, thing that's getting proposed. And I think that's like, again, that's like another really great practice in decision-making. Decide what your fundamental, most important guiding principles and work streams are. And then people are going to organize themselves around that. People are still going to do what they're going to do. You don't have to control it from the top, but controlling the strategy through that core messaging is like such a powerful way of exerting cohesion without control, which is, I think, a part of like what movements need. Can we hear any other stories or questions around like trade-offs that you're navigating or how you're making choice points in your own work?
There's a couple good ones in the chat, Karina.
My brain scrambles when I try to read the chat. Would you like voice them? Would you represent them for us, Kiara?
Yeah. Thanks, Candace, for sharing in the chat. I'm just going to read your words verbatim so I don't mess up anything. Candace is currently with the Hive Fund for Climate and Gender Justice and has spent 10 plus years working in startup orgs and many others in the sector. She's witnessing and thinking on how many orgs struggle with balancing horizontalism or power sharing and values with the need to make effective and clear decisions in a timely manner. So I think it's a little bit on this tension of speed and inclusion, but more specifically on the horizontal power sharing and making decisions in an effective, timely manner. Would love to hear from Sasha on that.
It's a great question. Erica and I used to talk about this a lot, Erica at August, around how organized labor plays into this in a really interesting and complex way. I think there's this really interesting conversation that's happening, right? So one, I will say, in the event of the crisis around abortion access that we are about to all experience, we're going to look for people to blame. Just so we are as people, we're going to look for like, who's responsible for all of this? And I think a lot of folks are going to look to repro organizations nationally and say, you got it wrong, or you didn't do the right thing, or whatever. And who are we going to point to at those organizations? The people who are in charge. And then, there's like going to be some staff uproar. We're already seeing a lot of that in the movement. There's a fascinating article in The Intercept about particular employee strife at an organization called Guttmacher that many of you know. They do like research and, very in-depth kind of policy analysis and data work for the movement, which is invaluable. And I think about the tension around what we want to be true, that everyone is empowered to make decisions, but also you opt in and are like explicitly given decision rights based on the role that you play at an organization. Can you tell at work at August once upon a time? I totally
Sasha, this is something that we are obsessed with, like being clear about who has what authority and pushing it down as far as you can. But the most important thing is explicitness. Who decides, even if others disagree, and even if those who disagree are more senior. Whew, that really challenges people.
And then I think like the twist that organized labor like brings to that in really unique and interesting ways, we're also seeing a lot of social justice nonprofits unionize. And that sort of being the response to desired explicit decision-making that a union sometimes affords you, not in all cases, but oftentimes affords you. And then like this tension in that. So I think, you know, especially organizations that talk the talk and walk the walk, like want it to be true that they can allow folks to be empowered in their roles and stuff, but like at the end of the day, they're not really empowered at all. And so I think the only solution that I've seen to that is, thanks, Erica. I know Erica is speaking my language and we're all reading all the same things. The horizontalism and power sharing, the only thing that I've seen like interesting, especially at scale, I would say, in social justice nonprofits, like really at scale at large organizations, is the desire to unionize, because folks are seeing that as the only way. One, it's like a model that we know and are familiar with, and it's a little bit more accessible than the rapid reorganization that I think we, and sort of more innovative ways of organizing ourselves in organizations that I think, you know, we see this in the corporate world of what are folks testing and learning, and how are the Zappos of the world teaching us anything or not? We don't really know, but I think that tension point is very real. So other than the experience of how unions are helpful, I don't really have good examples of organizations.
I'm having a mind melting moment that I'm going to name, which is that we work across all sectors. So corporate, philanthropic, as well as nonprofits. In corporate, there's so much talk about empowerment and agility, but all that's happening on like the cultural plane, right? There's manager trainings on this and that, and like cultural shift can happen. What I'm hearing you say, Sasha, is that organizing in the like progressive advocacy space has become like sort of the tool or like the proxy for like, this is how to distribute power, to power share, to have authority in the membership of the organization. And it's not about like culture and practices, or maybe it could be, but because that stuff feels like too ambiguous or out of reach, it's like, or union organizing becomes the way to have a shared vocabulary and approach to doing that kind of explicit distributing power. Am I hearing that right? And it seems like duh, but also I love hearing that.
And also the premise of this article is like, when we organize, particularly in the absence of a union, how, what are the gains that we make in that? I think it's, we saw a lot of really interesting racial justice organizing happening at a lot of organizations, obviously in response to, it's really weird, right? If we think about like, it took the murder of a Black man on camera that we all saw to then spur this like whole like workplace organizing. And then it's like, where are we now? So I don't know, I'm sort of having this moment of like reflection also on how intense like those moments are that spur action and energy, and like oftentimes a trauma response that we're all kind of collectively watching and experiencing, certainly at different levels based on our identities and our proximity to the reality. And also what workplace organizing looks like to feel like we have more power and control, not only over our own jobs, but our own lives. What's sustainable through that? Like, what are the systems that'll continue to allow that to happen? And again, the structure that I look to as someone who comes or sort of has my roots in labor is unions are really helpful and long lasting. And there's accountability because you pay into them and theoretically they do things for you and you have a pension that's secured for the rest of your life. And sometimes they're not. And so that balance is a thing that I think we're interrogating, particularly as we're looking at organized labor, like kind of how it has ebbed and flowed, and also how work has become much more precarious for many, many more people because of the shifts in our economy in so many ways. So I'm not really answering your question, just sort of more opining.
No, we're wondering together. It's good. We have a hand up from Amina. Go ahead.
Thank you. After I put my hand up, my cat came and kind of my thoughts have jumbled a little, but like, so my name is Amina, and no, that's okay. And then I'm hearing you two talk, and like one of the reasons I joined the Fireside Chat was because some of the work that I do with clients and organizations is finding ways for them to do like actual legit DEIAB, JEDI, whatever acronym is in trend at the moment work. And I'm kind of curious, like, I think that like the organizations I work with are predominantly higher education organizations, nonprofits, and the desire and intention is there, and it's typically spurred by like horrific incidents, either nationally, locally, or like on campus, for example, right? And so there's like the immense desire to want to be good people, good organizations. And a lot of work goes into articulating values, hiring a chief diversity officer or like a director for DEI. And I think one friction that I find with clients is helping them to move past that reactionary trauma response, right? And so I'm just curious to hear, like, these are not grassroots, like organizations are not grassroots movements, they're not nimble like that, they don't move like that. So my question is like, what is it about organizations that make them not nimble to be able to move a little more like a grassroots organization? And what is a different way an organization can respond? Because they're not going to be a grassroots organization, right? What is a response that can be more, that can come more from like a non-trauma place that would be more helpful for something like a college or a corporation? Yeah, that's what I'm thinking. I don't know.
Those are very, very big and important questions. I'll try to answer your second question. So how do we move past like the initial shock moment and desire to do good? Tell me if I'm interpreting your question correctly. How do we move past the initial kind of shock moment and then like desire to do good and hire the right people and execute? And I would say, I wonder in that, like diversity, equity, inclusion work is ultimately white people and men need to give up power. That's it. It's not that deep. That's all we're trying to do. And I think there's a real question, like, are people willing to do that? I don't know. Like, I actually don't know the answer to that question. Like it requires us to reorganize around a different paradigm. It doesn't exist at scale. It is like the opposite of the American tradition. Mm-hmm. And I wonder, right? Like all that good intent, like all that money and all those black squares on Instagram and whatever else we saw, what changed? I don't know. There's this huge pendulum swing back in the other direction. I mean, like particularly around policing, right? Where we saw like Joe Biden fund the police, like, okay, this is like so different. It's like so different than where I thought we were. And this like mass reaction. And so I wonder how much power are we willing to give up? I say this also working in an organization for the first time that's led by a Black woman. This is true at Guttmacher as well, to the article that we referenced that Erica dropped in the chat. Guttmacher is being run by a Black woman for the first time. And all of a sudden staff are turned all the way up and like blaming these, right? So like also how do individual actors who need to bear that responsibility? We're still like products of the same system, right? So I don't know, that's like a very, very like existential question, but I wonder that because it does fundamentally require that we organize ourselves around a different paradigm that I actually don't know. Like I wasn't raised in that paradigm. I was raised in a different one. And so what does it take to unlearn some of that? Which is why I think new ways of organizing are so interesting. And like, I think we all know that there is something there. And I think I'm sort of hoping and waiting to see like, how does that model actually force a different power structure? And how does it not just repeat the same ones? Because we've literally grown up, like we don't know any better. And that is not like a me problem or you problem. That's like a collective, like this is the world that we're in. So that's sort of the thing that I struggle with.
It makes me think a little bit about we had a conversation before this as we were just sort of thinking about like, what are the themes, what are the tensions? And we were talking about like big rage, small actions, or big rage and focused wins. And like, I'm a pragmatist by nature. Like I'm always a like progress, even over transformation kind of a person. Like I own that bias in myself. the thing that this conversation makes me think about is like, you know, if the sort of like big rage response is like, write down the values, hire the person, like the focused wins response is like, what's the dial we're going to move first?
Yep.
What's the thing we're going to pluck off, break off, and like go at until we make some progress? And I don't know what that looks like in your organization. I don't know exactly what that looks like in higher ed. Like, is it about admissions and diversity? Is it about power sharing in the sort of institutional aspect of it? Is it around responsive curriculum? Like, I don't know what it is, but like from our work across all organizations, when we take a kind of like break big problems down into small pieces and then work at the piece until you make significant progress on it before you move on to the next piece, rather than again trying to like boil the ocean. And there's some wisdom in that. Again, I don't know the context specifically enough to know, but we were talking about this, Sasha, you and I, in terms of the like national even over local. Like, do I show up to the march, which like is about visibility, or do I pick like the racial gap when it comes to maternal mortality? And do I like work away at that problem because that is like a focused win?
Yes.
So I don't know. It feels like it's connected, but like, am I making a leap?
Yeah,
You know, that might be like too tactical.
No, I'm so curious in your work too. What are the wins that higher ed, like, are we going to measure like year over year, we have 10 or 15% greater enrollment and graduation rates amongst Black and Latino students or first gen? Is that a measurement? And like everything that we're doing is focused on that? Are we going to focus? I'll say at Planned Parenthood, Alexis McGill-Johnson, the president, her focus is unequivocally Black reproductive health. And a couple of weeks ago, folks saw Mackenzie Scott gave this massive gift to Planned Parenthood, and it is like overwhelmingly going towards improving outcomes for Black patients at Planned Parenthood health centers. And like there are real numbers and real data and real metrics around patient experience, because Black patients oftentimes do not receive the same care, because that is true across our entire health system. And so that is her laser focus and exactly what she's hoping to deploy resources to do. And we know that there are things that work. We know when there are more Black providers. We know that when we're deeply investing in community healthcare across the spectrum of care, et cetera. So I also wonder, kind of from the big wins and that desire to do great, how are we also being really, really deliberate? And to Karina's point, acknowledging that like the organization is a box, right? This ain't the revolution. I wish it was, but it's like really not. But it gives us some tools. Like it gives us a couple of tools in this moment. And like, is that good enough for me right now? And then like, let me carry on and do my revolutionary work outside if I have the time and the energy and the capacity to. And if I don't, that's cool. I'm going to pass the baton to someone who does, because like, that's also important. But can I zero in on the tools that are at my disposal in this moment? Because the institution isn't all bad, right? Like there are good things that are happening, and there are things that we can do. And, you know, whether it's in education or reproductive health, the impact can be transformative. It can literally change someone's life to give folks who never had access. Like, I'm going to go deep and make sure that students from these 5 high schools are like feeders into XYZ schools because we've never focused with that level of intention. Or I'm going to make sure that our focus on health equity is laser focused, because outcomes are so disparate. And we know that if we invest in A, B, and C and hire X, Y, and Z, that is going to make a meaningful impact. So those kind of small wins are things that, not to leave us with no hope around this, but those are things that I try to focus on given the tools that I have.
Speaking of the tools that we have, one of the kind of promises of this session was like a couple of tools. So I want to, as we begin to wrap up the session, Kiara, I think you've got the slides waiting for us. And we're going to offer up just 2 things that kind of have been like undergirding our conversation. One a little bit more than the other, but I think the other one is still interesting. Would you bring up the even overs for us, Kiara, and we'll take a look at that together. So one of the tools that we use across so many different contexts at August is the even over, which is about making a brief statement that clarifies our priorities and our trade-offs. This is what we've been sort of really started talking about. Like, how do we know what's more important in this moment now, even at the cost of something else that's really, really good? So this sort of format here is good thing A even over good thing B. It's not an even over if it's good thing A over bad thing B, because that's easy. It's harder when it's good thing over good thing. So if you flip to the next slide, here's a couple of examples. So we were just talking about this. A good thing might be transfer, like the revolution, transformation. An equally good thing is small wins. A good thing might be speed. Another equally good thing is inclusion, national, local. You know, it's a good even over when you can flip it and it still is helpful. So here's the flip of all of these. Like we were just talking about, the good thing we want to prioritize in some circumstances is those small wins, because the organization is not the revolution, it's just a tool. And inclusion or accessibility, even at the cost of speed, we need to slow down, take a few more weeks to design, like what Sasha talked about, this like sort of beautiful array of ways to be in the movement, but that takes more time. And even just like local, national, local, you know, where am I putting my energy? When we're clear with ourselves and with the people that we are sharing power with, we can, I think, move forward more powerfully together. So this is one kind of practical tool. And the way that this can show up is like in conversation, like, okay, we need to do something tomorrow night. Like, what are our even overs? What are we prioritizing? So that we know how to spend our time, our resources, and get people involved. Another quite practical tool, you can go on to the next slide, that we talk about a lot is decision methods. I'm sorry, Candace had to go because I think she asked kind of an explicit question about this, which is like, how do we talk about how decisions are getting made? I think this kind of undergirds that, like, power sharing and consensus, but how do we still move forward? I think we often have a mindset that there's like two modes of decision making. It's either like, I decide. Oh, Candace, you're here. Either I decide or we all decide together. And I think we can get stuck in that kind of binary, but there's some options in the middle, if Chiara can bring those up. There's two other ways of thinking about this. There's, I decide, but I get advice from people who have so much wisdom to offer me. I'm sharing power with them in that, like, their wisdom is influencing me, but I'm not really asking them for their permission or for their consensus to move forward. And it's a way to move quickly, but wisely. And then another thing is what we call consent. Another version of this is like safe to try. It's the idea that instead of asking, as we do in consensus, does everyone agree? We ask, does anyone object? And so that lowers the threshold of commitment, right? Of how much we need to agree. When we're using a consent-based method, we can do what we said before, which is like, I know what you're doing. I commit to it, even if I disagree, even if I'm more senior. And I think what we're trying to communicate here is like, there's a broader palette of methods that we can explicitly choose from that might be right for the moment that we're in. So as a follow-up to this session, we're gonna send these out, and maybe a few other little resources that we hope might be useful. The other one that I'm gonna sneak in here, because we've been talking about it, is just like small bets, like breaking big problems down into those small bets that we sprint against because we're trying for a focused win instead of to sort of take on the whole picture. So we hope those things are useful. They've definitely been sort of in our conversation, but we wanted to offer something up to you. I think as a closeout, I would welcome anyone who is just like, what's something you're taking away from this conversation? What's something that you feel like is going to maybe stick with you, that you're going to keep thinking about as you leave? Feel free to voice that in the chat. I would also very much welcome an unmuting if someone wants to share. I'll start that, like, unions is the advocacy organization version of the corporate, like, distributing decision rights. So like, that's a method that organizations default to, and it's a good one also with its limitations. I'm just going to be like noodling on that. Is anyone else willing to share a takeaway or something that's sticking with them from the conversation?
I loved the talk about explicitness of like who makes the decisions. Like, I don't know what you got, that culture that you were describing, but it's nice to be able to take that back of like being very explicit about who makes the decisions, regardless of where they are or what their role or title is. So I appreciated that.
Yeah, a little hack on that is just asking, who makes the call on this, even if others disagree? You can just like say that in a meeting, who makes the call on this, even if others disagree? And it's like a helpful cultural nudge, as well as just a good question. Thanks for sharing that. Anybody else have something that they want to take away?
I'll share something quickly, and I just turned on my video for fun to say hi. But I'm taking away just how how big the problems feel, and sometimes how like tactical some of the things that we apply are, and just holding those two things at the same time and reminding myself that like this is a long arc. The change that we're making is incremental, and it is like okay to give ourselves permission to like make micro improvements, because those micro improvements in how we are making decisions and how we are juxtaposing and balancing the choices that we have to make do help to alleviate just some of the pain that can exist in doing such challenging work. So I just loved the stories that you were telling, Sasha, about some of that, and that's a good reminder for me.
Erica, what else? Mike, go ahead.
Okay, thanks so much. It's been great. One thing I'm feeling inspired by is like we see so many of our more corporate partners get so stuck in decision making because they think that the stakes are so high and they have to get everything so perfect. And what you've shared is such a great reminder of like when the stakes are way, way higher and so much more urgency, and yet you must find a way to still move forward and make decisions because it's so necessary. So the idea that high stakes are somehow a barrier to being able to make decisions isn't a good excuse.
Thanks, Mike. What else? Just give it my 7-second pause as a facilitator, see if anything else bubbles up. All right, I think with that, we'll close out. Sasha, thank you so much for joining us. Thank you for your storytelling. Thank you for like bringing those Augusty thready pals into it and like helping us stay hopeful and thinking about how we get this work done in the face of really immense challenges. Thank you to Kiara for doing the logistics and getting us here with support from Cassidy as well. And thanks to everybody who joined and like decided to spend this hour with us. We'll send some stuff out to you afterwards. We're super, super grateful. Have a great rest of your day.